Okay, folks, I want to call the meeting to order, the workshop, Town Council workshop of August 27, 2018, with a moment of silent meditation and salute to the flag. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, tonight I'm going to open a workshop for the following: discussion with Christopher Kearns, Chief of Program Development for the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources within the Department of Administration, relative to solar siting, policy information, PowerPoint and model solar ordinance development timeline. Chris,
Perfect.
yep. So,
My
I
colleague,
just want to preface, if I could, this is a presentation by Chris and his group. We're not going to talk about current, past, future, current solar projects in town at all tonight. So,
My colleague Nancy Hess from the Division of Statewide Planning will also be going with the PowerPoint tonight. Just out of curiosity, is it helpful if we dim the lights at all by chance? Because there's those in the back.
yeah, you can shut them off.
Oh, don't do that.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, no shades.
It's all right. No, it is about the projector screen.
Oh, yeah.
Just don't feel bad. Perfect. Well, thank you very much for having us tonight. We have been going across the state working on the solar siting guidance for various reasons. Primarily as municipalities, some have comprehensive solar ordinances in place in terms of who can and can't do what on a job site or a particular type of property. Some towns have ordinances drafted around a specific scale of projects, and then several towns have no ordinances in place. So the Office of Energy Resources, the Division of Statewide Planning, heard from municipalities, heard from various stakeholders to try to do outreach efforts and working on this information here tonight, but also will follow a model template ordinance regarding siting and taxation, and then followed by a brief report. Our timeline for this process is to wrap up in late October with putting up the final projects. We've already been out to a couple towns, so we started in Cranston, then we went to Charlestown, and then Coventry. We're here tonight. We'll be in Westerly in about 2 weeks, followed by public sessions in Jamestown, Bristol, and Providence. Our goal is, we're based out of Providence, but we realize a lot of people want to participate, weigh in, but it's not fair to have everybody just come to Providence for all these meetings. So we're trying to get geographically throughout the state as part of this process. And then final disclaimer, obviously, I think Nancy can add on to it, is the documents that we're working on, we're putting out, it's not enforced at municipalities. What we're trying to do is provide guidance, citing ordinance information for the towns to utilize within their respective land use decision-making process. So this is not a statewide mandate that towns have to do. It's a volunteer effort by our offices, and then the towns can decide if they want to use any of that relevant information.
Can you go back one slide, Paul? And building on that note, we wanted to point out we're not doing this alone, not in a vacuum. We have an advisory group of a lot of people giving their volunteer time. Our group is consistent of state agencies like Chris's agency and my agency, Department of Environmental Management, the Rhode Island League of Cities and Towns, but we also have environmental groups. We have groups like the American Planning Association participating. We have the Rhode Island Tree Council. We have the Rhode Island Farm Bureau. It's a group of stakeholders that we think represent every side of the issue. We have private power developers within the state group. And what we're trying to do is present a balance on what's happening with this land use in the state at this time.
Nancy, which municipalities in terms of their respective planners have participated?
We've got a bunch beyond the ones involved in the American Planning Association. We have Coventry, Cranston, Narragansett, Exeter, Charlestown, and Richmond. We've done a presentation in Charlestown, and we've done a presentation in Cranston. And I you that discussion with your own planner, Jim Landfill, earlier when we were coming down to kind of get the setting and the lay of the land, so to speak.
If you go back one more, Paul, just the schedule of meetings, there we go. There we go. Just in terms of the tentative, Narragansett is now confirmed, so we'll send out an updated schedule probably over the next week or two. But that gives you guys an idea in terms of where we're going to be throughout the state over the remaining roughly 2 months of this process.
So if you miss something tonight, your next opportunity will be Westerly, just down the road.
Exactly. So why are we doing this? In part, the state and the region are shifting in terms of its power generation. Historically, we've had a region that's been dependent on coal, nuclear, and oil. We are shifting away from those resources. Coal plants are being phased out and not being re-permitted. Gas pipelines and gas plants are not popular in the Northeast region. In fact, I think 31 municipalities, including the town of Hopkinton, have passed resolutions opposing the proposed gas plant up in the Burnsville area. And then nuclear, we have a limited amount of nuclear power generation in the region, so all those things are being phased out. We are going to have to replace those power sources to meet long-term energy needs. So one of the dynamics, one of the reasons we're seeing renewable energy promoted and also just installed in various parts of towns and cities is because we're shifting from a centralized energy system where you have power sources in specific locations to a distributed generation power system where you have those resources scattered throughout their respective states.
Excuse me, can I ask a question?
Sure, and let me actually know, we're going to go through the slides, but if people want to interrupt, ask questions, we're happy to take questions along the way.
Yeah, I have a question on the prior slide.
Okay?
The clean local power, there are areas where you're considering storage. How are you storing, since my understanding is we do not have batteries that can store? So what are you thinking is going to happen in those storage areas?
Yes. So one thing, I'll add to the next PowerPoint that we put out, is there's a lot of energy wonky type visuals of going from a centralized power system to a clean local. This was kind of the 101 level type slide that I could find.
You don't really have storage.
Storage is something that's coming along in Rhode Island, but also the New England market. Massachusetts is starting to promote energy storage. There's the opportunities potentially with offshore wind. But it's still a growing niche market in that it still hasn't gotten to a scale where it's economically viable for a number of projects.
That's
So,
what I'm concerned
yeah,
with, is that
so-
it's not really, they're not created yet.
so it's growing little by little. It's like the solar industry back in the 70s where it was slow to take off. We are seeing potentially energy storage is likely the first phase of it is likely to be to the residential market. We just opened up the opportunity for energy storage. The challenge is, again, it's a niche market. There's few companies that sell solar with energy storage type devices. So Tesla Solar City is starting to look at that. Sunrun is another large national player. But a lot of our local solar companies, it's not proven to be economically viable in terms of the total cost.
So that is something that you're anticipating over the next 10 years will be developed.
Absolutely. Energy storage is definitely going to be a growing sector, a growing portfolio of a lot of these projects, because again, the energy storage addresses the dynamic of when the sun's not blowing and the wind's not producing power.
Hey, just one quick question. Why don't I see a hydro power up there? Because apparently Quebec has a ton of hydropower coming out of there. And why don't we purchase some of that? Why aren't we bringing that down into our
So
state?
hydropower is definitely a viable resource. It's encountering the same challenges as ground mount and wind ground mount solar projects in terms of there's a significant amount of tree clear cutting to bring the distribution transmission lines from Canada through Maine, through New Hampshire, through Massachusetts into Rhode Island. And that has overlapping jurisdictions. So we have actively looked at that opportunity, particularly 2014, 2015. Massachusetts was originally going to pursue large-scale hydropower, but I think it was the Vermont Energy Facility Siting Board denied the project developer a permit to access Vermont properties because, again, the resources there, it's just getting that power to the New England region and it requires a potentially significant amount of tree clear cutting, flooding of areas, then it can also have tribal ground that potentially would be flooded to allow this resource. So like solar, like wind, it has its own set of complications. Oops, sorry. This gentleman right here.
Scott, go ahead.
My question is, I'm going to be at next town council, I want to know if you might not know the answer to this. How many cities and towns now have had a moratorium to come to grips with the solar issue? Because I know, particularly probably like smaller towns like Hopkinton, do not have something in place to protect the interests of the town when it comes to zoning. I'm just curious, how many towns you know are in the moratorium stage, and how long do you think the average moratorium would last?
So of the 39 municipalities, I'm aware of 2 moratoriums that were temporarily put in place over the last 6 months. I believe, I think Gloucester put a temporary moratorium in place, I think, through like November time period. But as we've seen with moratoriums, just got to be careful with those, because again, there's projects in the development, whether they're the big projects or a homeowner project or a business that's installing a rooftop project. You can run into issues in terms of the unintended consequences, because again, a lot of the times the attention is those big projects, but there are also all the other scale solar projects that don't get any of the press attention, that are kind of out of sight, out of mind. But that's where we stand. I know several years ago, several plus municipalities enacted wind turbine moratoriums, but never addressed it in terms of providing guidance in terms of where are the appropriate locations. But that's the best of my knowledge right now.
And neither one of us are attorneys or solicitors, so that's about all we can say about moratoriums. We would encourage your council to talk with your local councils, or if that's a road that your community chooses to take. We are aware of your existing ordinances, but we can get into some of these more detailed questions as we go along.
Exactly.
Chris, does the state give any guidance on that 38.5%?
So
all the sources that are listed, ideally what you'd like to see, and does that get drilled down to each municipality, or does it just
So
say?
ultimately, it's, so if you go back one slide, Paul. So there's a slide right there, the second bullet point saying 38.5% renewables by 2035. Depending on the state, in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, that number ranges from the low 20s to the high 40s in terms of their what they are required to acquire for renewable energy resources. Our renewable energy resources met by both in-state and out-of-state projects. So it just depends on the market, the permitting process within the local municipality. It's not defined in terms of each municipality has to have a certain percentage to meet that objective. It's ultimately the market and the municipalities make their own land use decisions. And then we track that to see how much is in-state, how much is out-of-state. Next slide. And again, just kind of highlight some of the things I've already said. No energy project is perfect in most cases. There's always trade-offs and dynamics that we see, whether it's commercial large-scale solar projects, concerns about the footprint that it takes up. A wind turbine takes up a much smaller footprint, but people don't want to see wind turbines. Large-scale hydropower, the transmission lines that have to be cut in terms of the trees that are lost, to even offshore wind in terms of we're looking at offshore wind projects, and there's the trade-off and the dynamics of how do we take into account active commercial recreational fishery issues. So no energy project is generally perfect.
Has your agency done any studies on the financial impacts tax-wise as far as solar projects, large solar projects at all?
In terms of
Tax revenue or those type of
we have actually a slide here that I'll get to in terms of maybe part of your question, but I'd be happy to follow up on that.
And what we've heard from our advisory working group is identifying the impacts that this is a land use issue, this is a siting issue, and some of the impacts we identified are deal with water quality, they deal with things on the site like forests dealing with forest deforestation, dealing with wetlands, dealing with site plan review, stormwater erosion and runoff control. And we'll talk about a lot of these things later, but we're also getting into issues of climate change and responding to climate change. Everybody wants their well to work. I know this is an area of the state where you don't have public water, You need electricity to run your well. And when that well doesn't work, boy, are we all on the phone to the National Grid to get power back. So it's a dynamic of a lot of different things. We're also trying to promote farmland sustainability and balance providing our own power. Can you go to the next slide, Paul? We also want to put out that we are pro-conservation and preserving open space. But one of the things you have to do when you're a state agency is balance a series of goals and objectives. We don't advocate putting solar power on anything that already has protection or easements on that property. And what we're trying to do through the PowerPoint here and other guidance we'll be putting out is develop materials that municipalities, whether they be planning boards or municipal planners, can go to when they receive an application for a solar system and get information about exactly what is there, and what are the resources on the site, and what has the state compiled that they can use to make a good decision on.
So I realize that you're protecting the installation on the conservation properties. Are you also allowing those conservation properties that are like parks or are large portions to be able to do, like we are with farms, 1 acre of solar so that they can use it for their own electrical use? So even though it's conserved, but there are many that, like Lincoln has a big park and ponds, is there any thought to allowing them an acre, which will allow them to use the solar renewable to use for their own electricity?
Yeah, it's something that we're looking at right now. We've done a couple installations on the state properties up in Providence. We're doing a solar carport parking lot installation at the Public Utility Commission office in Warwick. We are starting to look at some of the DEM properties in terms of their parking lots, but also parcels on the land that are adjacent to like their DPW facilities, but also rooftop. So it's something that we're actively looking at. Unfortunately, as I've learned, state properties take time to navigate through the process, but it's something that we're actively doing.
I would think so, but because we use it for farms and specific to keep them viable, it might be one of the ways that the state can recoup money they spend on the parks, and the park can pay for itself.
Absolutely.
And if it's above a parking lot, who cares?
Yeah, absolutely. We're doing that now. Even the the wind turbine that's installed at Fisherman Campground, it's 100 kW. It's 157 feet height. There's been no issues that we're aware of with the town of Narragansett with that project since it was operational in the fall of 2011. A lot of times people see the big turbines up in Providence and think that those are really big power generators. That small turbine is actually probably more productive in terms of power generation than the ones up in Providence. But to give you an example, that 100 kW turbine, you couldn't build it in most municipalities because they banned it outright.
Chris, speaking of the same subject, the governor's pushing for a certain amount of wind power, solar power by I think it's 2020, and what is it? It's not 1,000, 2035. Anyhow, the bottom line is that she seems to be putting the onus on communities like Hopkinton, rather than putting the onus on herself and saying, geez, we've got a lot of state land in this state, state-owned land. Arcadia is a perfect example. There are sections, and I've been up in Arcadia, there are sections of Arcadia that are just wastelands. And yet I haven't seen her, and maybe I'm wrong, I haven't seen her offer 1 acre of state land for any type of renewable energy.
We're actually doing a 3 to 4 megawatt ground mount solar project at the Lad Center in Exeter. We just had an RFP that went on the streets right now. We've got about a half a dozen solar companies proposing it. So that solar project will tie into several electricity accounts because we're building the project in Exeter, but we can tie the electricity to different state agencies, whether they're based up in Providence or down in South County. So we just, again, we've done, at the beginning of the slide, we've done our roofs up at the Capitol, our Department of Health, Department of Transportation, our building. We're doing the carport canopy installation in Warwick. We're doing this project at the Lad Center in Exeter. So we are pursuing projects. Could it be done quicker potentially? Yes, but again, we're just going through that process.
Could be done larger, that's what I'm
But
saying.
there's also consideration of how the lands were acquired and purchased that the
Yep.
state has to take into account. Many of the lands, like our Arcadia management area or the Big River management area, were acquired for other purposes and come with restrictions based on the federal funding that acquired them. So it's a balance, and we are trying to do that. DEM is adding a lot of solar on even their garages and their facilities. You may be familiar if you go up Route 3, Richmond to Exeter. They just took it out down at the Dolly Park, the old campground, and the chimney's left standing, but there's a working garage there. There's solar on that garage. So they are doing it in incremental pieces as they can, as also their budget allows them.
The dynamic even with like the Lad Center property in Exeter is because it's, again, there's a fire station, fire activity training on the property. You also have the federal, I believe, cemetery adjacent to it. So there's a lot of dynamics in terms of land use. You know, are there any restrictions on the property? Is the cemetery planning any expansion type work that may go onto that property? So would we like to go quicker? Absolutely. I think we potentially can once we get this project under our belt. This is the first big project that the state is partaking as it relates to a ground mount solar project. Again, there's a lot of roof mounted projects. We've done a couple of wind turbines over the years, but unfortunately they just take time to start to finish.
Is exit 6 owned by the state?
Exit 6?
Yeah, we used to call it the Rhode Island Desert.
Yes. That's part of the Big River management area.
Oh, it is part of it.
Yeah.
Is that the one near the truck diner? Truck stop area?
Center of New England, Hopkinton Road.
Okay.
But that was acquired for water supply purposes. So whether or not a solar field can go in there would be something
Because
the Water
I mean,
Resources Board would
yeah.
have to be able to keep.
That's already wide open.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example. I think it's off of exit 6A, next to the truck diner, truck stop area. URI, South Kingstown, and Narragansett teamed up, put out an RFP. They're doing a 40 megawatt ground mount solar project at that old industrial commercial zone that Amber and others used to do activity that's been rumored to be like a Walmart dating back to like 1996. But they're converting that entire kind of commercial industrial type lot and also trying to get a tomato producer farmer in to that location. Because one of the dynamics with a lot of those commercial industrial zone lots is there's no electrical infrastructure in there. So the economics without sometimes these projects make it cost prohibitive. So that tomato farm potential opportunity wouldn't be viable because the economics of bringing electrical lines down just for that project wouldn't bear the economics. But because it's tied to a large solar project and you have power lines potentially coming down along 95 north, it makes the project economically viable.
I have a question. I just wanted a clarification on something that Nancy said. When you said that if no solar on protected areas, that would include wellhead protected areas as well as sole source aquifer areas for solar?
The recommendation right now, and if you let us run through all the slides,
Okay.
we have a whole bunch of more recommendations about properties and how to start a foundation of the zoning ordinance by the end. What we heard loud and clear in some of our other public meetings was a cry over some of these solar farms might be going on areas of lands that already have protections on them. So that's why we have this slide up front.
The only reason I mention that is I can't see that slide from here, so.
There is a handout.
Sure, I just want to make sure we don't miss that point at the end.
Yep.
Thank you.
The Big River management area, as it's been called, I don't know the exact name for it. In 1969, it was rumored that there was going to be a reservoir there, and it just died on the vine. So what's the status of money that was received from the federal government, or where we can go with that and put something in there, or in, like Tom said, in the desert, which is diagonally across the street from the big area?
I'm sorry, what was the year that occurred?
1969.
Okay, I wasn't born yet, so I'm not going to take that question.
No.
I was just here.
Is there a statute of limitations on the federal grant?
And I don't want to be flip, but how long do we have? Because that's a whole nother workshop in itself.
We got an hour and a half.
It is under the purview of the Water Resources Board, and that area was acquired through a public bond that the state put out and taken by eminent domain. But if you go to the Water Resources Board, it's wrb.ri.gov, there's a history of that project on their webpage.
Okay, thank you.
All right, slide. All right.
Yeah, so again, these are, we're not going to dive into these, but again, the advisory working group that Nancy referenced earlier, different perspectives, what we try to do is put together a list of principles to work off of as we develop both the PowerPoint presentation, the model, or it is the report that we'll put out. Happy to answer any questions, but again, this is kind of like in the weeds, so to speak. We're happy to dive back to it if people have any questions. Sure.
On the very first one,
Yep.
your goals for thoughtfully strategic development of renewable energy projects of all sizes.
Yep.
Have you also decided, or have you also considered that you should take city and town by city, each by each, all 39 cities and towns, and to determine what you think the allowable percentage of land taken from the town for solar would be unacceptable? For instance, we are rural, so we want to keep a lot of our farmland and our rural quality. So is there, if we know how much land we have, do you have just a concept of 1%, 2% of your land could be solar?
So I think we do have a slide to touch upon that to a certain extent with farms. If we could maybe just go through and come back to your question as we go through the PowerPoint.
But again, this is all a voluntary basis, and this is not a mandate, and the state respects that in Rhode Island, land use is local, and it is a local decision. So we really put the ball in your court with information to decide what's appropriate for Hopkinton. Because my favorite saying in planning is it's not one size fits all in Rhode Island. There's 39 cities and towns, and what might work in Pawtucket is not going to work for Hopkinton. And even in your Charahoe district here, what works for Hopkinton may not work for Charahoe, Charlestown may not work for Richmond.
But we do have an example of...
Since you're here, is
Yep.
to learn from us too, what we would like you to perhaps try to address.
Absolutely. I think we have an example of such an idea to think about with farms when we get to that slide. We can come back to it. Next slide, Paul. Again, this is kind of just putting everything together in terms of the applicable state laws, whether on the renewable side, climate change, or land use regulations. We'll probably touch upon some of those throughout the slides, including the Zoning Enabling Act and the process like that.
Okay, next question. Property tax exemption waiver option approved through town councils for business commercial net meter systems. We're assuming that there's no tax exemption because if anything, that's one of the things we get from solar.
So there's
are
two...
you presenting it or?
Yeah, so there's two types of projects. One are that you're just installing on the system
Sure.
and just putting the power back to the grid, and that National Grid is paying for the power produced. A different example is if this building put a solar system on their rooftop, it's just being used to reduce their electricity bills.
Right.
So we have a statewide formula for towns to receive revenue from all the projects that are installed, just selling power back to the grid. What we recommended is if you're a homeowner or a business, well, homeowners are exempt from local taxation now per state law from 2 years ago. But if you're a town hall or a business that is just trying to reduce their electricity bill, why would you want to then assess a local taxation wiping out that electricity savings from that installation? So you get taxes from the large scale projects that sell all power back to the grid, but what we're recommending is, again, there's a law in the books from the 1980s that gives town councils the ability to waive property taxes on that solar installation if it's just being used to reduce their electricity bill. So if a business is installing a solar system to reduce their electricity bill and save that $50 a month, they use that $50 a month to pay off the loan for the solar system. But if you assess a new tax on that solar system, then it negates any reason to pursue a project.
That doesn't help my city.
I would be honest with you, I think you were the first town council member to question or seek a reason why people that want to just reduce their electricity bill, why to tax
I
it.
definitely do that, but I think we tax.
That's your decision. You would be, that would be a unique situation. I'm not aware of other towns thinking that way.
And I just want to point out on this slide, as we go through, we've thrown examples of, not everything is a solar field that's either on a farm or on a commercial property or a gravel bank. We have places in the state, we have like 4,000 solar installations, Some of these are like, this is Cranston West High School. It's on the roof of an existing high school.
That would be a
Yeah,
net meter
lot of
system, so it's
these.
just reducing their electricity bill.
So as we go through the slides, you'll see examples of existing other types of solar installations.
So we do that here too.
Yeah. Next slide.
Next slide.
And this plan is Energy 2035. It's the state plan for all of these issues, all of these topics that have come up, like where does our energy come from? What kinds of energy do we have? How are we distributing the energy? Not just renewables, but all other aspects of energy. And this is where our vision and our goals are set. There's a handout in the back with a very long web address to get to it. But if you want to know anything about energy we haven't talked about, it's in this document. And this was approved by the State Planning Council in 2015. It was a joint project between Chris's office and my office.
Excellent. Okay, this is just some general information outside of the solar siting process in terms of building electric permit processes, in terms of siting ordinances shouldn't have anything regarding the rooftop setbacks and those type of things. That's defined through the state building code from the 1990s in terms of having a statewide building code law. Statewide building electric permit process. Prior to 2018, there was 39 different permit processes in terms of obtaining a building electric permit. Since January of this year, per state law, there is now a universal building electric permit application form. So whether you're doing a roof-mounted residential project or a large solar project, all towns have the same building electric permit application now in place. And then finally, the statewide fire code process. There was an effort to address this because the state fire code is generally about 5, 6, 7 years outdated right now, and it has to go through a long, lengthy process. And fire marshals at the local level were kind of not sure what to do with these projects when they were proposed to them in terms of a fire management plan in the event of something bad happening. So the state adopted a blanket-wide variance that allows local fire marshals to evaluate the projects individually on their merits and determine what is an appropriate fire mitigation plan in terms of access roads or what is done between the panels in terms of either kept as dirt or vegetation that can grow between the panels.
Christopher, is there anything flammable in solar panels? I mean, is it viable? Is it a real idea that solar panels can catch fire or something like that?
So I've been with the State Energy Office since 2012, and again, I think on the residential side, dating back to 1998 when these installations started happening, we're probably well over 5,000 homes that have been installed solar and probably hundreds of commercial projects. I'm not aware of ever receiving a report about a fire incident at any of the locations.
Is there
But
a
we get that question every meeting.
Yeah, we do.
Yes, when I see that, I think to myself, well,
Yep.
must be a potential fire hazard there.
Is
Yeah.
there a state comprehensive thought about if we're going to decrease our dependence on energy and we present these solar farms and wind farms, that the energy is not sold out of state?
So energy is, the electrons are like water, they flow where they're needed. So most of any of these projects built are then ultimately tied to the state's renewable energy standard, the 38.5%. Again, some of the projects, the electrons flow back to the grid ultimately, it's just a question of how they're assigned. So if the town of Hopkinton, I think you guys have like a closed landfill location within the town. If you installed a solar system, what grid would do is track, monitor all the electrons produced from that system, and then tell the town, or the town would tell the national grid, all right, I want you to assign it to 4 accounts at this building, the 5 accounts, down the street. That's how it
I
works.
understand that, but there are other places where you're sold out of state. So it could be University of Massachusetts buys the energy from some of the very large megawatts. So they're being sold out of state, not in state. Is there any state plan to say
So-
a percentage, this percentage must stay in the state of Rhode
Well,
Island?
ultimately, all these programs are tied to National Grid, and National Grid services the Rhode Island service territory. So the power produced from our systems isn't then exported into the Massachusetts markets and sold in there. It's assigned to the applicable electricity accounts that are registered by National Grid within their Rhode Island service territory. Now, that's different in terms of, you have a sliver of the state passcode utility in northern Rhode Island who deals directly with that utility, and then you have the Block Island Power Company dealing directly with the town of New Shoreham. but all the energy produced is tracked, registered by National Grid within the state of Rhode Island region.
Next slide.
So this gets to a point in terms of what we'll discuss later on the slide in terms of, there was a law passed by the General Assembly 2 years ago related to farms and only farms within the state's Farm, Forest, Open Space program. And that there was a dynamic where farmers wanted to essentially pursue a commercial renewable system on their farm as a supplemental income beyond what they received for revenue. But there was a dynamic in terms of the taxation rules, in terms of what would happen if they did a larger solar footprint. The tax assessor could reassess the entire land value instead of a farmland value to like a commercial residential tax value. So what we did was we negotiated with various parties, including some of the environmental conservation groups, in saying, okay, if a farmer wants to do a renewable system on their property, what would be,
in that program.
and they're in that program, what would be the sweet spot? So what we said is 20% of the total acreage a farmer could do, they could do it up to 20%. Within that 20%, the local tax assessor could reassess that solar footprint from a farmland value to a commercial land value, because it's now a commercial property, it's not a farmland property, but keep the other aspects of the farm within the farmland value. So that's what we've done, and we're going to get to a slide too where we kind of tied that law to a potential idea about the potential siting and how big of a project it would require.
Some ideas that come from the planning realm of this and addressing this, as it's a new land use, and it is taking communities, not by surprise, but just like wind came out several years ago, communities were trying to address wind. This is a new land use. We suggest that you start with your comprehensive plan, and by state law, communities must address energy production and consumption in their comprehensive plans in some way. And we have some points that the comprehensive plan should consider. It ties back to the state energy plan, Energy 2035, but balancing the ability to plan for your land use and future land use, but also decreasing your dependence on traditional carbon-based energy that's being produced. So what we recommend is the plan should consider that there are various types of solar systems. As with communities in Rhode Island, solar systems are not one size fits all. And promote the use of previously disturbed lands, like we talked about the Rhode Island desert as an example. Gravel banks that are no longer functioning and have not been restored. Maybe you have an abandoned junkyard or a scrapyard or another site that might have difficult remediation. Solar might be an option to reclaim the site and put it into an active use. And we are working on a summary report that's going to come out with a lot more detailed guidance, pulling from lessons we've learned through other public meetings and talking with communities. And this is my colleague, Paul Gonzalez. He's done an inventory of all the Rhode Island cities and towns, what they have for a zoning ordinance, what they've done in terms of their taxation ordinances, and a few other things that we will include in that report. We can go to the next slide. So you've addressed the issue in your comprehensive plan. The tool to implement your comprehensive plan and the tool to control land use is your zoning ordinance. And communities are authorized through Rhode Island general law to adopt the zoning ordinance to control the use of land and how it's developed, and its purpose is to implement its vision of its comprehensive plan and protect the public health, safety, and welfare. You should include solar development in your zoning ordinance in some way, and consider again the sizes are not one size fits all, but craft requirements and reviews carefully to balance allowing the use and creating barriers to the use, but also respecting the rights of landowners.
I got a question.
Next slide.
Oops.
Yes, go ahead.
How many cities and towns specifically have solar in their zoning ordinance? Do you happen to know that?
Well, do you have how many?
Roughly about half. It's addressed in different ways at different details, so there's about half that do mention it in some way.
And within that half, some of it's residential up to big projects, some of it's just focused on the large projects. So within that half, some have comprehensive and some just addresses certain niches for projects.
I just want to see how this town compares to other towns and that type of thing.
Good question.
One of the things that I think people, our citizens, have a difficulty with is scale. And when someone says, oh, it's going to be an acre, or it's going to be 50 acres, and it's, can you go back to the prior? This is a 6.3 megawatt solar system. Well, we have on the books 11 watt, which is twice that scale, twice as big. Sometimes one of them is actually twice plus another half as big here in Hopkinton that have come up before us. But I'm finding often citizens have no concept of what the scale is when they say it's 11 megawatts, or, and that's a megawatt, not a kilowatt. So I find that a difficulty, and I don't know how the state can address that to help citizens understand what they're going to be looking at.
So the rule of thumb generally what we'll do is, so the Reynolds Farm here in Hopkinton, I believe it's called, I think they have a 250 kW ground mount solar project. That's generally a half an acre to a full acre of lot land needed for that scale of project. When it comes to megawatt scale projects, we usually use this rule of thumb is for every 1 megawatt, it's generally 3 to 5 acres of land required. I use 3 to 5 because depending on the topography of the land, but that's generally the rule of thumb growth. That's just under 6.5 megawatts. I believe that's like 25 megawatts of acreage that is required for that project, which is located near TF3 when you're leaving the airport.
And that is also a difference in the availability of vacant land in Warwick versus Hopkinton.
Certainly.
And we can include something like that in our guidance. for sure.
And the guidance is really for citizens, because they don't understand the scale they're considering.
Can I ask, this is prime commercial land that this went on.
So this was actually a commercial, but I think it was a contaminated type of a brownfield
Was it
type of
really?
lot that wasn't going to be viable in terms of building likely any new activity in terms of, usually these properties, they don't want to dig beyond a certain depth. The beauty with solar is generally depending on the racking installation.
I would think that'd be a key element in whether you want to put solar on a piece of property or you want to hold that piece of property back for industry or a commercial venture that's going to employ people and provide a service for the residents.
Yep, and that's a dynamic that each town is grappling with in terms of, we've been to some towns that don't want to allow solar on commercial real estate for the hypothetical. Something may come down the road that we want to pursue, which is fine. We've also seen towns say we prefer within residential because they don't want to give up their commercial property. So it really depends on the town and their perspectives.
May I ask a question?
Oh, sure.
So, when you do the spot zoning and you change it from residential to commercial, after these solar panels are done, does it go right back to residential?
So I'll give you, so the project off of exit 6A, again, right across the street from the Exeter truck diner stop. It's a project in the town of West Greenwich. So this is the URI South Kingstown Narragansett project. So I believe that property was zoned commercial. They're rezoning it residential because there are probably, I think, 10 to 15 homes adjacent to that industrial type lot. And I believe there's going to be like a deed restriction attached to the agreement that says once the solar system meets its shelf life, it's zoned residential, but with a caveat that it can't ever be built upon in the future with housing development. So some towns do that.
No, I understand that, but what I'm worried about is if you're living in a residential area
Yep.
and they zone it commercial for solar, and then after the solar goes out, then they put in some kind of industry there. It doesn't go back to residential, so
It would come down to whatever the planning board or the zoning board or the council put in the agreement for allowing that property to be rezoned.
The ones in Hopkinton are going back to residential.
Automatically.
Automatically.
it goes back to residential.
Correct, without any approval of the council. Here,
Correct. All right, so addressing it for our zoning, going through your zoning code, this is kind of a zoning 101 primer on how, okay, now I want to talk about a solar development in my zoning code. And this is, we're suggesting you go through all your zoning districts and you consider in your zoning use table the options for solar systems. And your options under Rhode Island enabling for zoning is it's not a permitted use, it's an outright permitted use, it can be allowed as an accessory use, it can be allowed by special use permit, or another option is you can create an overlay zone districts and have siting conditions for people that apply to that overlay. An overlay is something where the existing zoning remains, but you have studied your town and you've identified certain places where you think it might be appropriate to have this use if some construction and siting standards are met, and people can apply to be in that overlay district. Next slide. So you've decided where you want it, and you've indicated in your zoning table by your different uses, whether you have residential, commercial, industrial, or other types of zoning in your community. How are you going to review it? And your review options vary, and again, this is a choice by community, by the ability of staff that you have, and by your different districts that you have. Reviewing something in Cranston is going to be vastly different from reviewing something in Hopkinton. Cranston has a department of 6, 8 planners, and we have 2 here. And they do a good job. They do a very good job. But you can review things if it's allowed as a standalone permitted use. No additional review, go in and get your permits that you need from your building and zoning official. If you want to allow it as an accessory use or an existing use, no additional review, again, go see your building and zoning officials. If you want to allow it by a special use permit, in all or certain districts with the siting standards that be met, under the zoning enabling law, that requires a planning board advisory opinion to the zoning board or commission who makes the decision. Next slide. And again, these are more options. You can allow it in all or some districts, but require it with a tiered development plan review. And development plan review is by the enabling statute either done by your staff or your planning board. And you recommend tiered because again, it's one size does not fit all. Solar systems come in different sizes. You can allow it in all or some districts, but require major land development review. That's the same process as a residential subdivision would go through. That has multiple steps. It would require the planning board approval and a public hearing with notice to the abutters. The steps are pre-application, master plan, preliminary, and final. It takes the longest amount of time. And then allowed within an overlay district, and within that overlay district, the siting standards that you've decided on, you can then decide, is the overlay going to float and wait for people to apply, or are you going to just make it mapped and designate certain areas in the town? And then within that overlay, decide how you want to review it, either the special use permit, development plan review, or the major land development process. Next. So, now we're getting to it. This is where our first recommendation comes up. After going through all that technical zoning stuff, and the state laws, and the setting, and the legal setting, and the comp plan and everything, we've looked at this and we've worked with our advisory group, and the recommendation is for communities to go through a tiered development plan review approach after they've decided what districts they want to allow solar systems in. Have staff review for simple projects, like maybe an accessory ground-mounted system for small and medium solar systems. Have formal review by the planning board for large solar systems, and include a public informational meeting. One thing that we do recommend is that there be some sort of notice to abutters for large projects, and it be incorporated within the development plan review process. And when you're looking at your zoning ordinance, we also say, don't forget special areas and special districts in your community, such as historic districts. Different places, you may have places where there are easements assigned to the property as well. Next slide. So why are we recommending it through a development plan review process? Working through the advisory group and some of our public meetings, We've heard that the planning board is the expert board in the community. The planning board does detailed site reviews. When they review either commercial land developments or they review large-scale or small-scale residential subdivisions, they look at site conditions, they look at on-site issues, they look at off-site issues, and they make decisions, and they're used to judging applications to be consistent with findings for the protection of the public health, safety, and welfare. Zoning boards typically do not review on that scale. They're usually a very discrete review of a particular individual lot, and whether or not the request for relief from the ordinance will meet with the standards and the general purpose of the ordinance.
And in terms of why we recommend this, if it's a special use permit, it goes to the zoning board with the planning board giving an advisory opinion, whereas if you do it through a development plan review, the final say in terms of the application decided by the planning board.
Yes. All right, is there some of your slides?
And I'll go through this quick because I know we've got a number of other slides. Again, this is just an overview of the different types of ground mount installations in terms of the racking when it's deployed at the site. Depending on the topography, if it's a closed landfill that's capped, you want to use a ballast ground with the cement blocks. But in other locations, you may want to use a driven or a screw type platform to secure the solar systems to the property. Next slide, Paul.
And you kind of think, well, we've kind of changed gears a little bit. We actually found out from planners that they don't know what these things are and what the parts of systems are and what they should be looking for on site plans. So we're kind of also doing a primer on the systems themselves. And these are the parts that planners and planning boards will see on site plans.
Yep.
So they have to know the terminology.
Exactly. Next slide, Paul. So this is an example, Councilmember, in terms of one of the state projects that's underway right now. This is the solar carport canopy project in Warwick off of exit, 14 or 15?
Jefferson Boulevard.
Jefferson Boulevard exit. And we are trying to get the word out now in terms of, we've heard from municipalities, so we're trying to make some adjustments within our state programs that we have some leeway on. So we're going to be opening up a category for solar carport canopy projects in 2019. I suspect, and we have another slide upcoming if you want to get to, one of our, oops, sorry.
Just a question, do you think there will be some state funding for that?
So this is,
Carport idea?
yep, exactly. So what we're going to do is through the National Grid program, we're going to put out a certain amount of megawatt capacity for solar carport canopy projects in the spring, summer of 2019, because we're wrapping up the 2018 year, and we're just about to propose the 2019 program year to our Public Utility Commission. So a good colleague of ours at the Department of Environmental Management did some just aerials of some parking lots at various locations. So I couldn't think of a big parking lot within Hopkinton, so I just chose the one down in Westwood at the Shopping Plaza Center. In Richmond, the YMCA. So these are the type of lots potentially that will be viable for solar carport canopies. Our goal, hopefully, is either a half a dozen to over a dozen solar carport canopy projects are awarded in 2019. The reason why we're flagging this now and getting the word out is a lot of the existing ordinances that are on the books don't take into account solar canopies. So they have like a height restriction that applies universal for all solar projects of say 11 to 12 feet. Paul, if you go back one slide to the PUC location, that project itself is somewhere between 19 to 22 feet above the ground in terms of a height. So some towns' ordinances wouldn't allow that to be installed within their current ordinances. So it's going to require action in a number of municipalities to change that to allow these projects to get built. Next slide, Paul. Next slide.
This is also, go back to that previous slide of the parking lots. This is also a slide that can be used to show people scale. Like how many people know how big 2 acres is. That's the old, you want to go back to the old A&P shopping plaza where the YMCA is, 2.3 acres. I never would have guessed it was actually that big. So, yeah. All right, so one of the things we heard in some of our other public meetings is don't only tell us how to do it, but tell us some of the issues that have come up with it so we can have some pre-advice about some of the things and know what to look out for. The picture is an example of something you may have seen in the Westerly Sun last December. This is on 138 by Harvest Acres Farm. The contractor started construction in December when the ground was frozen and it rained and he didn't have his property erosion and sediment control in. He was constructing outside of his DEM approved Ripples permit. So hence there was flooding off-site onto a residential property. It was corrected by the power developer and DEM did come down and monitor that situation. So little tiny things like that we're going to include in our guidance that make sure that you know what the construction season is on the Ripples permits. Make sure that disturbance to wetlands doesn't happen from improper soil erosion sediment control. I mean, starting construction in December kind of seems like that's not a good thing to do, and this is an example why.
So the planning board is supposed to monitor this?
Sorry?
We're supposed to monitor this in the town?
The zoning official in Richmond, and that will vary by community based
Not
upon.
our town.
Zoning official.
What does that have?
Sherry.
But that is
Sherry.
Sherry, she's the one that's going to do all of it.
that may vary by community based upon the responsibilities of your ordinances. But usually it starts with the call from the affected neighbor. The affected neighbor actually called the police reported it to zoning and planning, then called DPM, and it all got resolved.
My concern is not so much the neighbors on property. What happens when it goes onto a state road? Who is, I mean, obviously the town feels some responsibility, but what does the state do when the runoff is on a road that they take care of?
The state will then have to be in touch with the property owner, like
Okay,
DPM
so
was
the
in touch
state-
with this property owner.
So the
That would be the DOT,
DOT
if it's a state road. If it's a local road, then it would have to be your highway or your DPW.
But if it's a major road, it would have to go to DOT.
But the property owner still has the responsibility to keep all of
Oh,
his
sure.
runoff on his property.
I'm just talking about when an error happens, I want our town to know who to talk to.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Some of the other things, the questions we've heard is decommissioning plans. What happens when 20 years, 25 years has gone by and the solar system is no longer viable, functional, or active? You can require something that's called a decommissioning plan. You can require a financial security as part of your ordinance and part of your application process. What you actually want to do is up to each community to decide, but we do recommend that be a portion of the ordinance. We also want to make sure that when you look at things, you look at mitigating habitat disturbances, because we are highly aware, like in Hopkinton, we are surrounded by a lot of habitat corridors, a lot of open spaces, a lot of protected lands, so you do have to be aware of that. Connecting to utilities and the electric distribution system, and the previous one that I just mentioned, talking about.
And the connecting to utilities, electric distribution system, what if the owner of the solar project does construction activities at a site without National Grid's approval, before National Grid has given approval that they will allow the project? Do you have anything to help us make sure that they can't start clear cutting before they have approval from National Grid?
So the way that the process works is a landowner or a business has to submit an interconnect application to National Grid. First verify whether or not it's viable to National Grid's distribution system. So if it's a small scale solar project, it usually just goes through one level of the study. National Grid gives the approval, and then pending the local planning or zoning board, the local permit, they get their approval, and then they'll install the system, and then Grid's crews will come out and do the applicable electrical work, and then you have your,
Our problem is the megawatt.
yeah, I'm getting to that,
Right.
Just in terms of
We know
sequence.
that's okay.
Yeah. So the large scale projects also have to go through that interconnection study initially, then they have to do an impact study. Grid has to sign off on a project to be connected to their distribution system. So if a solar developer is building out a location without National Grid's authorization, Grid won't approve the project to be interconnected to the system.
So we should be able to say you cannot begin one of the large solar projects unless you have National Grid approval in hand.
Speak for that.
Yeah, we'll speak to that, but again, National Grid process is pretty tight in terms of it.
And it's long.
It's a comprehensive process depending on the scale of the project, how the system will be interconnected in terms of, is there an existing substation within the area or is a new one going to be required? But ultimately, National Grid has final say on the interconnection of the system. It's regulated heavily by our Public Utility Commission. So developers will build out projects potentially at a site and then wait for National Grid to interconnect it, but I don't know most developers that would build out a project at a site first and then get National Grid's authorization. That's a risky strategy. I'm not aware of any developers that are doing that, but anything connected to the distribution telephone line, that's administered and enforced by National Grid, not the city. Good question, though.
Can I ask you something on that, if I may, on habitat? Has anyone, I'm new to this discussion, has anyone brought up the idea of having, since there's so much discussion about pollinator habitats and stuff, putting pollinator habitat as a
Absolutely, and we actually have a slide to that, we could just get to that, but that's definitely, the pollinator topic has been raised by the Nature Conservancy and others in terms of, okay, between the panels, what opportunities, but we have a slide, I think, that.
Yeah, actually, sir, there's an issue with that due to fire regulations, and we had thought to put that into our changes of our ordinance, but due to fire concerns, it has to be a low-growing grass. So we have thought about that, but there were some concerns from our fire codes.
And I think we can address that in terms of the fire code issue. Literally, what triggered the statewide fire code variance was a local fire marshal was denying a fire permit variance for a ground mount solar project on a closed landfill because they thought the dirt was going to catch fire. So after that happened, we were like, we got to figure out a kind of a common sense thing. But that's a very good point in terms of we can make recommendations in terms of vegetation or flowering or seeding native plants to the area. And the fire marshals have flexibility. I don't know what happened with your fire marshal, but the reality is, again, it grows in the spring and the summer, and then it dies off in the winter, and then it regrows. We're not aware of any fire hazards presented. We know that other states are looking at this, including Vermont. So it's certainly something that the town could revisit with any future applications, if the council wants to.
All right,
But good point, thank you for bringing that up.
so now we're flowing into some of our preliminary recommendations that we put together with not just us, but the working group and all those stakeholders and all sides of the issues. We will detail these in more information as we go through. We're coming out with the zoning ordinance template. We'll provide a model ordinance taxation template, and then we'll provide some comprehensive plan guidance and some of the report.
So this first slide really just kind of stresses in terms of, we've had towns adopt the citing ordinance but not address the taxation issue, or vice versa. So I've had towns where a tax assessor will call me and say, okay, I have this citing, but what am I supposed to tax it as? There's no guidance at the local level. So what we're saying is do things at the same time. So if you adopt the citing standards and you get the applications in, you know what the taxation rules are. So we developed the model taxation ordinance, to your question earlier today, in terms of taxing all those projects that are selling power back to the grid. So I believe like the Reynolds Farm, that sells all the power back to the grid, so you guys are appointing taxation on that project and some of the other large projects in commercial zones that you've approved over the past 2 years. But we also had a provision in there in terms of if you're doing a net metered system where you're just trying to reduce your electricity bill, we gave the discretion of the town saying, do you want to be reviewing every single project on a case-by-case basis, or you just want to adopt a statewide or a town-wide rule regarding that process? So to Nancy's point, that will be reflected in the model ordinance templates that we put out towards the end of next week. And I don't know whether or not, because I was here last year, you guys may have adopted that taxation ordinance. So you've already addressed
State
it.
enabling, isn't it? Enabling state enabling?
So there was a state law that said if towns wanted to tax things, they had to do so using the statewide formula if they were entering the tax treaty agreements. So I think you guys may have already addressed it. I just blanked out. I should have answered that with the original question. Next slide, Paul.
Yeah, sure. So these are the foundations of what should go into a zoning ordinance that addresses solar development. We're recommending you develop an ordinance without the one-size-fits-all approach. Don't include acreage and percentage restrictions on different types of land use. Consider reciting in your application criteria for industrial, commercial, and manufacturing lots that are different from residential or farm lots. Consider both flexible and different acre coverages for places like landfills that are closed, gravel pits that are no longer functioning, commercial industrial lots versus sensitive sites, undeveloped residential lots. Focus your solar ordinance on land use regulation, not the type of renewable energy system size or power generation. You are enabled to regulate land use, so that's the basis of the recommendation. Renewable energy system sizes and how the power generated from them are set by the state's metering and renewable energy growth laws, and they're regulated by National Grid and PUC. And as Chris mentioned, there's 2 other separate places that have their own little power grid, Pasco and Blackhawk.
Yep, and 2 things to this slide is, again, we're trying to get people to think about when they do these ordinances, is not doing the one size fits all in terms of down in South County, Kent County, there's a lot of either active or abandoned gravel pits that are within residential zone locations that may be suitable for solar, but some towns say you can't do any solar within residential zone, well, then you're banning those locations. To the issue of land use regulation, not the sizing of the system, I remember at a municipal meeting about 12 months ago where the town planner told the county council, I'm not going up onto the roof to count the panels in terms of how many are on the roof or on the ground. That's administered, regulated by National Grid. We really just want to focus on the land use issue.
All right, so again, consider the use of certain lots of the difficult redevelopment potential. Said it a number of times. I think we can go on the next one. Chris mentioned earlier, chairman and height restrictions for ground mounted solar systems to the type, zoning district, and topography. Because again, topography and land use can vary from site to site. And ground mounted commercial solar systems have different heights when compared to solar parking lot canopies. So you need flexibility in the height. And consider buffers, and also consider transitions between varying zoning districts. Don't forget that the property line doesn't stop, that's not the end of the world, there's something on the other side of the property line. You need to consider what that is.
Yep, and what we're going to do as part of the executive report, we have a number of case studies that we're going to use with the advent of drones. We're able to get the aerial photographs of these projects, and I think the big thing with what we've seen a lot of the projects that have come up is there's not a proper buffer transition zone in terms of utilizing the existing vegetation, tree lines within an area, and we'll get to a slide in terms of the Lady Christmas Tree Farm project, but that's really critical that there is a proper buffer, particularly with anything within the residential zone locations. Excellent. Yep, so in terms of our preliminary recommendations, the projects that you want to see get built that have a permitting process that favors to get those projects built versus some of the larger scale projects. So any roof mounted project, it's an accessory use, it's being used to reduce the electricity bill. Don't have it go through the same type of permitting processes as a large ground mount solar project. With the caveat being, if it's within historic districts, that you want to make sure that your local historic board or commission does a proper review of the application as well.
If you have one, do you have a historic district in mind?
Yes.
Oh, and we really appreciate that on an earlier slide on the historic district, you also thought of the views from a historic area. I really appreciate that. That was really good. Thank you.
Very great. I think we've covered a lot of these things already in terms of historic properties, enforcement with DEM and the decommissioning plan. Emergency response plans, again, those are part of the general filing that a planning board receives in terms of the access road in the event that they need to access the property throughout the year.
The historic property, we were giving some web pages so that there were questions not just for municipalities, but also questions for our developers if they fall within one of these districts. There are listings and there are web pages where you can look up information on sites and buildings. And again, the point about the decommissioning plan, very important to address what's going to happen to the property when these systems are no longer working.
I do have a question.
Go ahead.
I think there's, like you checked it, going to one of the hearings, I know this is a generic thing, not on site, but the ability of one landowner to financial issues apparently that person had in regard to financial matters, and I was just wondering, what do they have to do? Do they have to put down bonds or something of that nature, just in case a few years in a row? How do we assume that somebody is going to have the financial responsibility to take care of this in the future?
Yep, so these projects are predominantly, some could theoretically be self-financed, but most of these are financed through a renewable energy company. So as part of that process, the bond deposit would be provided by the developer towards the town to put into an escrow or whatever process that you utilize. But that's borne by the developer, not generally the landowner.
Yeah, but my follow-up question would be, is that put down before you allow them to put the solar in?
Yes. Yes.
It would be a condition of the final approval of the project. Every community already does this. You do it for subdivisions.
Yep.
You have construction bonds. You have maintenance bonds for subdivisions. This is just a different type. And you would work, your planning board should work with either your treasurer or your financial officer for the process you already have established for that and follow a similar path in collecting a financial security. Some towns take bonds, some towns want outright cash, some towns take letter of credits. So it's really up to each town to decide what works for them, that they have something in the event the property owner goes away, the power developer goes away because they're all in multiple corporations, and then there's nobody around if there's a public health and safety issue. The money's there for the community to take care of that problem if it happens in the future.
I think our biggest concern on decommissioning is the holes in the ground, everything underground has to be removed. Otherwise, they cut off at the level of the ground, and you can't build a house without running into 8-foot steel poles every 4 feet. So I think that's one of our biggest concerns on decommissioning, and I know our planning board's addressing that.
And you can set that as a standard in your local ordinance, what you want the property, the state of the property to be returned to.
Yep.
And you have to put that in your ordinance so you can hold people to it.
Do we know the real lifetime of a solar system? Do we have any numbers on that to know how much we need in a bond?
So the average life of a solar system realistically is somewhere between 20 to 30 years, depending on the maintenance of the system, and that applies to whether it's a roof-mounted residential installation or a ground-mount solar project. So that's something that the towns want to take into account when they're determining the appropriate dollar amount as part of that decommissioning plan, because these energy systems, again, are a 20 to 30-year life cycle. The panels aren't going to generally
Are we going to expect a dollar amount to cover 25 years, though?
What do they cost?
That's a big amount, a large amount.
To estimate.
Yeah.
What's the estimate per panel?
Yeah, I have to follow up with you guys on that one in terms of, I know
We're researching that.
several towns have decommissioning plans and different financial bond costs.
So we would have to know that.
But each respective town determines what is potentially a depreciated value of the system over the lifetime of that period to determine which dollar amount they want to have up front before any construction begins.
In the 20 to 30 year, that doesn't sound feasible because technology moves so fast that these solar panels would become more advanced and you'd want to change them out and put newer ones in there.
If they're still producing power, I've talked with homeowners that installed systems from the 1980s where they're still going strong.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they are, but as technology moves,
If you paid off the system and it's still producing a revenue or a savings for your property, why would you replace it?
yeah, if it was, right, but, you know, if you
Yeah, but things do potentially
That's not
happen.
taking technology.
But the panels themselves, they've gotten more efficient, but the fundamentals of the solar installation haven't really dramatically changed since they were deployed in the
I
70s.
can't swallow that, man. Let's see.
Look at panels from the 1980s, look at panels today, they're just more efficient.
It's more efficient now, right?
Yeah.
I think they'll become more efficient, and even if they get smaller, but National Grid also only gives them 5.6 megawatts, which means even if your panels are more efficient, unless National Grid's going to allow you more power, you can't replace them with something even more efficient that makes more power. Because
Well, what I'm
they
getting at-
will allow you a certain amount.
Right, but what I'm getting at, there's so many variables that we don't know, like, what if these become, like, the newer ones are less toxic or something like that, and then there's always reason to change, you know?
The market's always evolving, and
Right, that's what I'm saying.
certainly will in terms of if you told me 10 years ago energy storage would be tied to these systems, I probably wouldn't have guessed that. But the fundamentals of the solar installation haven't changed in terms of the racking, the panels, the inverter boxes. What's happened is the solar system has become more efficient in terms of power produced from each panel requiring less panels. So that's certainly something that we're certainly going to see evolve and potentially strengthen over the next 10, 15 plus years. But the fundamentals of an installation really haven't changed over the last 20, 25 years.
I was just
Yeah, I have a question. To the gentleman in the blue shirt, you brought up a good point on the amount of bonding that should be required for this. Is there something that you guys could look into as to what per kilowatt or per megawatt, what is an average?
Yep.
Because
So we're going to start.
something that's going to have that money. I mean, I know it's going to draw interest, but you're not getting much of that now. But
There's no regulation, so the interest is,
So
anyway.
but something that's going to be there for 20 or
So
30
part of
years.
our goal with Paul is he's gathering all the existing ordinances. We want to pull all the decommissioning plans that towns have adopted in place for the last couple of years.
Well, maybe not all.
Not all of them, but
Range.
we're trying to get a range. Because ideally what we'd like to maybe do as part of the final report that goes out is similar to what we did with the taxation formula for the tangible taxes on these systems, is to try to provide some either a formula or a guidance or what the average is that we're seeing across the various
This is very
municipalities.
useful.
Thank you.
Very useful.
I have a lot of questions. First, the state solar goal is 1,000 megawatts by 2020. That's what it was. Based on the Rhode Island population of 1,060,000. The state uses 13,000 megawatts of electrical energy per day, and the solar goal represents 7.6% of the daily usage. Hopkinton's population is 8,116 and uses 99.8 megawatts of electrical energy per day. To date, our town has approved approximately 51.21 megawatts of solar projects, which represents 51% of our daily usage. My question is, have we approved enough projects? Can we at least no longer approve residential projects that require zone and comprehensive plan change? That's one. Next one.
Sharon, let him answer one question, he's never going to remember.
Well, I waited.
No, I know, let's answer that question
We
before you go on to the next.
few more recommendations to cover too.
So in terms of your question about the 1,000 megawatts,
Right.
so that's comprehensive in terms of multiple renewable resources. So, for example,
So that's even more reason why Hopkinton has already approved enough.
so that's a local issue. I can't answer that question. What I can just in terms of the 1,000 megawatts that you referenced is a goal with a variety of renewable resources. So 400 megawatts of that will be coming from offshore wind. There's a certain percentage that comes from land-based wind, solar, small-scale hydropower. So it's not just solar. I just wanted to.
But the point is that your goal was even if it was 7% by 2020, and if it's 38% by 2035, we have already approved enough without approving projects that you have to change the residential zoning. That's my point.
But we're not changing anything. That's a local land use town council decision within respective municipalities. That's nothing the state is involved with.
All right, you had another thing that you wanted to promote, proactive, comprehensive utility distribution system planning. How do you envision that happening in the wake of the onslaught of solar projects? Who is responsible for the system planning?
So ultimately, the distribution plan is administered by National Grid or Pasco Utility or Block Island Power, depending on whose service zone is being managed. It's ultimately regulated and approved by the Public Utility Commission. So they have the oversight in terms of the distribution lines, the gas pipelines, all those type of things. That's all regulated by the Public Utility Commission and then administered by the respective utilities.
So is there a number?
The Public Utility Commission is over all of the
Yep, so the
National
Public
Grid?
Utility Commission regulates all of the utilities within the state of Rhode Island. The state has 3 utilities, the predominant one being National Grid, followed by Pasco and Block Island.
I think what Sharon's going after, because it's an excellent question, is what does our local utility support? And have we already reached that?
So again, ultimately, every project that's proposed to National Grid by a landowner or a developer has to go through that comprehensive interconnection study in terms of what's viable. The study may say that to interconnect that system, it requires upgrades in terms of a substation or a new telephone pole being installed and relayed power, but that's all site-specific and evaluated on a case-by-case basis. by
Right,
National
so
Grid.
who's overlooking the total? I mean, how do you report back to that public utility commission so they can say, hey, we've overdone it, or we're.
That's local.
That's, again, the siting and what gets approved is local. The permitting process is local. Power generation, how it all configures into the grid, that's evaluated on each project merit by a utility, and it's regulated by the Public Utility Commission process.
And my final question.
Sorry if I'm not getting, that's
That's all right. The final question is about the decommissioning plan. You said something about, I want to know, what is your definition of site restoration requirements that are part of the decommissioning plan? How can you replace the destruction of 7,000 trees in 20 years? It's not going to happen.
No, it's a good question. I guess in terms of decommissioning or how the town decides in terms of what's done with that property in terms of commercial or residential development, again, that's a local level decision in terms of, again, the state has no jurisdiction authority in terms of telling towns what they can do with their properties.
And we actually heard in a couple of public meetings, they did not want to be told. They were afraid that we were coming to do this presentation
So
to
it's just
tell
like,
them they had to do something. And we were like, no, this is voluntary, this is informational. We hope it helps you make these local land use decisions in a more informed way.
I believe the town council being, I'm saying correctly, the town council is a legislative body, is not required by law to even agree to solar in any zone in the town. Correct me on that. There's no.
So what's your question?
The town council as a legislative body is not required by law to allow solar in any part of town, in any zone. Is that correct?
The town, in each respective town council makes the decisions on land use, whether it's solar, commercial,
They're
residential.
not legally obligated to put it in any zone in town.
That's the kind of legal questions I can't answer that.
Are you saying that it's all up to the town council?
Every town makes their decisions on land use, whether it goes through a planning board, a zoning board, a planning zoning board, or it goes back to town council. That's the jurisdiction of 39 municipalities.
But if the planning board says no and the town council says yes, then what are we doing all this for?
I can't answer that question.
Yeah, but they recommend it.
Right.
The property you showed a slide in Richmond, and that's the Richard Schurzak property. And what happened with that initially was the landowner called the town. The town said they were not responsible, called DEM. DEM told them to call the town. And this was a great article that was in the Wesley Sun.
Yeah.
And this circle went on and on and on.
Yep.
So it's the runaround that folks like us that are going to run into situations like this if there's a problem. It's not, in all due respect, it's not that easy to fix.
What we could do is, again, we're working closely with DEM in terms of, I do hear that issue. I personally want to know if there's a project that's being installed that's violating a state permit or stormwater law. We want to know about it immediately, because we'll reach out to DEM directly on that subject in the town. But what we could maybe think about doing is like kind of a point of contact within the respective agencies, including DEM. So a homeowner, obviously, or a property owner that's being impacted, certainly you want to notify the town right away, but we could try to establish a link for you to know who the point of contact is within the respective state agencies.
Thank you.
With regards to the financial security, our current ordinance requires that the applicant propose an amount that the planning board finds reasonable, and that gets accepted. Both the form and the amount is determined by the planning board. There's been a concern that the amounts may not be adequate for the actual amount that's required to clean up. So I don't know if there's some guidance forthcoming about both the amount, like on a per acre or per megawatt price, as well as the instrument, something that's resilient enough to withstand, a lot of these projects are changing hands between companies and entities, something that 30 years from now, it needs to be collected on, an easy way to find out who you go to get the funds.
Yep, so it's, again, part of this kind of road trip that Nancy and I are going down to towns, we're trying to do our best to take into account public comments, questions, and putting them into these PowerPoints. We're going to look at this issue in terms of, I've heard it tonight, so I'm going to start, I'll chat with the League of Cities and Towns and the renewable industry. We'll take a look at some of the ordinances that have been on the books where projects have been built and the dollar amounts. Let us pull some of that information together, because we're going to be putting out, again, another version of this PowerPoint in September, along with the model ordinance. Let us go back with your guys' information about this decommissioning plan to see how we can incorporate your comments in the next drafts that come out.
When you look at the amounts of the approved projects, just keep in mind, they might be low because we don't really, I mean, all due respect to the planning board, they're not experts on projections of deconstruction costs in 30 years.
Absolutely, and I think, again, we addressed this in terms of the tangible tax issue with tax assessors. It took some time when we got there. Let us take these comments back about the decommissioning plans, and then again, we're always happy to come back sometime in the fall winter on this subject. Thank you.
Sir?
We do have some more recommendations that we do want to get to.
We'll just take this gentleman's question, then we'll go through some of the more slides.
A good number of people in our town are concerned about the decommissioning cost. It could actually be a very simple process. You have 1,000 posts in the ground, how long does it take you to take a post out? Convert that into labor hours. The price of fuel and the price of labor 20 years ago, if you fast forward it to today, figure that difference, fast forward it 20 years down the road, you can get a pretty good idea of what it's going to cost to take the stuff out. It'll be a little bit different, but it's a little easier to figure that way.
So I'm just going to make a request in terms of, you guys have approved a number of projects over the last couple of years. It would be helpful just to get some information about your guys' decommissioning, what you've used for dollar value, so we can start reviewing those numbers and
The
follow.
finance office can get you that.
Sure, I'll be in touch with that. Yes.
All right, so we wanted to let you know that there's more to think about than just the review process, but what is actually the concerns on the site. And these are the recommendations for environmental and wildlife criteria at undisturbed sites. Again, this came out of our working group of stakeholders. We want to limit the use of herbicides and control invasive plant species growing beneath or around any solar system. Minimize the disturbance of the topsoil. And require the maintenance and reuse of the topsoil. Require pollinator-friendly seed mixes and native plants to the maximum extent possible. We have a web reference for our New England seed mixture. As you do the site plan review with the planning board, you would look at that seed mixture, look at the plants that are contained within it. Usually seed mixtures give you a description. They'll tell you the plants by names, and they'll tell you the heights of the plants are going to grow, so you can determine if that's appropriate to be growing under the panels, between the panels, or outside the panels.
I have a question. Just what's going to stop anything on the seeding there?
Just finish
I mean,
your
you
slide.
want whatever you want, but what's going to stop seeds from popping up at any point?
I'm sorry, I guess I'm not following the question. What's the question?
Underneath, like, you want to plant all these nice things, blah, blah, but what's to stop other seeds from dropping in and growing up?
Well, again, there's going to be a vegetative management plan, and that has to encompass any fire official approval. But in
Yeah,
terms
what
of,
is the general method of this in larger projects? You must know how these large 50-acre projects manage that.
yeah, so again, in terms of these ground mount projects and the spatial separation between the panels, it's either right now what we're seeing a lot is just grass that's growing in between them, or depending on the topography, it's the dirt between them. So what we're trying to encourage as part of this process with perfect municipalities is the vegetative in terms of the seeding, the planting, the bee populations, in terms of how we maximize between the panels going forward. But ultimately, a lot of that will come down to collaboration between your planning board, your town council, and your local fire marshal.
Yes, but who's going to maintain, who is responsible for monitoring maintenance and what?
It's ultimately the landowner and the developer as part of the application that's approved by your local municipality.
The maintenance plan is a part of the application.
It's a part of the
Who is our local municipality? Who would that be in our world here that monitors that?
Both the zoning and building zoning
So you're
and.
gonna have a zoning person go to all these places, like
by the municipality on the staff and the enforcement division that they have within their town. The last point, we came up with a recommendation because we heard that fencing was excluding wildlife from traveling in places that they traditionally travel. Whether they're small, terrestrial based, the fences would stop them. So the recommendation is for putting a fence up that allows the wildlife, whether it's small terrestrial based, like turtles and salamanders and chipmunks and things like that, to go under their fence, raise the fence a few inches, or consider in areas if you're adjacent to a wildlife corridor, something in lieu of fences that would get the large animals, the mammals like the deer that are traveling back and forth.
They will jump over a 6-foot fence.
Yeah. Deer and fisher cats and whatever else may be out there, so. All right, next slide. So you want to cover the commercial initiatives?
So this is a visual of the East Providence landfill project. They're actually expanding out their system currently, and just before I forget, I know you guys do have, I think, a closed landfill. I'm not sure if it's capped yet. If the town's ever interested, we're game to help you guys get an RFP on the streets for that property. What we're trying to recommend again is not a one-size-fits-all in terms of a lot of these properties have been abandoned, so there's no accessory use. So we recommend a primary permit subject to a development plan review. That would have to go through your local planning board. But if you want those type of locations to be built on with solar, then make a distinguishable difference within your zoning ordinances, because we've seen in a number of towns where they have a special use permit across the board for every zone location. And at the end of the day, a lot of these developers look at the land values to build these projects on. And if they're going to go through the same permitting process, regardless of whether it's a gravel pit landfill versus an undeveloped residential zone, they're going to go probably where the cheapest land is for the do a project. So make a distinguishable difference within your zoning ordinance regarding the property, so it's not a one-size-fits-all. So this gets to the council's comment about in terms of how do we look at each town respectively. So what we put out with farmland properties is a lot of farmers do not want to have to sell their development rights for the full farm, but they're faced with a dynamic in terms of the economics aren't there for their current farmland activity. They're looking to do a portion of their farm to produce a revenue source that they can use to maintain the farm, keep it in within farmland within their family, instead of potentially doing something other development for it. This is an example. So it's the Reynolds Farm here in Hopkinton. It's a 250 kW ground mount solar project. I believe they're selling all the power back to the grid. The developer gets the revenue, he gives a percentage to the farmer, and then there's a percentage that goes to the town for taxation purpose. What we had recommended is similar to, we have the state law saying you can do up to 20% and the land value of the property won't change dramatically if you keep it within less than 20% of the total farm. So what we proposed, and it may not work with every town, is up to 20% of a farm could be used for a commercial renewable system. That may not be appropriate with towns with large farms. In terms of there's some farms with 50, 100, you don't necessarily want 50 acres being converted to a solar system, whereas a lot of towns potentially have farms with 5 to 10 acres, and you want to limit that percentage. So what we did was we just put out an idea for the towns to consider in terms of how they deal with the dynamic of a farmer who wants to do a commercial renewable system on a portion of their property.
You did add the 5 to 10, because we do have 50+ acre farms.
Yep. So
I think mentioning the 5 to 10.
So the asterisk means you need to look at the percentage that's appropriate for you. You could do up to 20% is the recommendation, but 20% in Hopkinton might be different than 20% in
Middletown, yeah.
Middletown.
And you have suggested possibly a reduction to 5 to 10%.
Depending on the town, so what we would recommend is kind of say, okay, how many farms do you have here in your respective town? Of those farms, say you have 15. Are all those farms 30+ acres or greater, or are all the farms 5 to 10 acres? And then look at the percentage, because again, most farmers just are looking for a portion of their property to do a system to as supplemental income. They're not looking to convert the entire property. So what we did, again, one of our primary principles is not have a one-size-fits-all ordinance within the size. So what we proposed was just give a scale and then allow the merits to be proposed to the planning board respectively for review. So if you go to the next slide, and again, there are critical things that need to be taken into account that Nancy has already brought up in terms of the environmental, the vegetative screening, the access roads, the interconnection process with these systems with National Grid. Go to the next slide. This is an example. This is the Lady Christmas Tree Farm in West Greenwich. They installed a 2 megawatt ground mount solar project. They're selling the power back to the grid. The farmer's getting a percentage of that revenue for keeping the farmland farmed long term. If you apply that 20% rule, what they did was it was a 92-acre farm. 12 acres was removed from farmland and rezoned as commercial. That's 13% of the total farm that was allowed for a commercial solar system. That system was installed back in 2013. I haven't heard of any issues, complaints, either by local people or environmental groups about how this project was appropriately sited within this farm property. You know, the top slide right there, you'll notice there are several homes on the left-hand side. As part of the application, they've maintained a tree cover as a proper buffer setback. And it seems to be a nice model of how to pursue these type of properties.
And something about our PowerPoint is we have a lot more case studies at the end of this, and we don't intend to go through every case study this evening, just to relieve you if you're sitting there going, oh my goodness, it's 8 o'clock, and you see what we're talking the whole time. So this slide is preliminary recommendations for a ground-mounted system on farms where it's going to exceed 21% or greater of the land. And we recommend that be treated as a primary use and go through your development plan review process with the planning board and have an informational meeting within that process so there's notice to the butters. All of the same principles about considering wildlife and pollinators and fire access and decommissioning plans and everything. Everything you would apply to the small accessory system on farms should also apply to the larger primary systems on farms or other lands.
Excellent, Paul.
Again, this is a case study. You'll see again, part of the final report that we put out will have probably a dozen plus case studies from across the state. Again, this was the farmland, I think, type property, zone light industrial within the town of Richmond.
And this is the one that had the erosion and sediment control problem, and that has been solved. And this is adjacent to where the Richmond Airport is in Harvest Acres Farms on the third way.
I have a general question. What is I know kilowatt and I know megawatt solar arrays. What is a DC megawatt?
So
Why
there's
is that different
all right, so
than?
this is the electrical stuff that I usually butcher. So it's
I know it's
So
direct
it's-
current and I know they generally change it to alternating current. This is something that will go directly onto the electric grid as.
So the power that's produced that goes to the panels, I believe, if somebody's in the audience, they can correct me, it's DC, and then it goes through the inverter box and it's converted to AC, alternating current.
This is
and then-
obviously not.
What is that?
This one would not be because it would be DC megawatts going.
No,
into
because it still has to go through inverter boxes and substations on the property before it goes on to the
Then why is it
distribution
called
system.
DC then? DC megawatt and others are just called megawatt?
I'd have to go back and
Because
just
a
type
megawatt
up.
would be DC to AC.
All of the projects are DC to AC. It may just be a typo mistake on my part. I'll take
Okay,
it.
that was, that's a possibility.
Good point. Thank you, Commissioner.
I can help with that.
Think of DC as a bad. DC is a bad.
You're done with the slides?
Yeah, I think, you want to take this one?
This is slides, Mark.
All right, so for large ground mounted systems on the undeveloped residential lots, we basically have the same recommendations. So review it and treat it like you would a large primary system on a farm lot. Consider the application to go through development plan review by the planning board. Not all residential lots will be appropriate for possible consideration. There may be some residential lots that it's not appropriate for by size or whatever reason. You determine that within your zoning land use tables, like we talked about earlier. We do want to say, importantly, put it in bold, make sure there's notification to abutters. The notice procedures, whether the town does it, whether the applicant does it, or whether the town and the applicant do it together, vary by municipalities. So basically, you do notice procedures in your land development and subdivision regulations. This would be no different. Add that into it. You can also consider a requirement that a portion of the lot that is not used by the solar project could be preserved voluntarily through a conservation easement as part of the application. quid pro quo, what's the benefit to the community? Have a large buffer under a conservation easement.
What about low-income housing?
And
What about a buffer in low-income housing?
that would be an idea if that works for your
I mean, if the
community.
state wants you to do low-income housing,
You could consider that if that works for your community, sure. And then use the existing natural vegetative screening or add new vegetative landscaping to mitigate impacts to views and buffers.
And in terms of the voluntary thing, ultimately, if the town wants to, they can make that requirement similar to housing development in terms of portions of the property that you put the conservation easements. We just did voluntarily because we didn't want to give the impression or telling towns what to do.
All right,
I have to ask a question about this last slide, and that is, what if somebody opposes, like you're going to say you have to notify abutters, so what if all the abutters don't want it, what happens?
That's a decision by the town council to local level.
That's not good for me.
I want to know, so he just told me it's you.
Yes, Joe.
I just have a question, my previous question, unless I missed it, it wasn't answered yet. As far as the protected areas that you spoke about, Nancy, I haven't heard the answer to that question when you talk about a sole source aquifer or wellhead protected area.
if you have those areas in your community and you deem that they're important, you certainly can include them in your ordinance, but you have to do that when you go through the process of a public hearing to adopt your ordinance. Those areas will not be in all cities and towns in the state, but if they are in Hopkinton, then
And are any of those lots or those properties that you referenced have bonds that were applied by the voters within Hopkinton?
Well, my question came up when I heard Nancy say that there would be no solar on protected areas.
Protected areas that have deed or conservation
existing
attached to them.
conservation restrictions.
So
Whether it's a town land trust or whether
Okay.
it's the state that they have acquired management properties, those.
I
existing
can understand that
conservation
for other areas, but when, as you mentioned, this area is solely on wells, and when you talk about aquifer and protected areas, I would recommend that the state would consider the rural towns, because we're the folks that are getting hit with all these developments. There's more solar developments going up than there are residential homes being built. With the wells, we need to have some type of protection when it's already been determined that it's a sole source aquifer and a wellhead protection is.
Thank you for those comments. We'll, if you guys have any suggestions in terms of things that aren't in the PowerPoint that we should reference, we welcome comments. I think Nancy and my contact information is in. Again, we've generally tried to incorporate the comments, so in terms of the wildlife and the bee populations, we got that from the Southeast County Conservation Group, so we provided a link in terms of what we could find about vegetative plans that are approved in Vermont that could be applicable around. So if you have any ideas, suggestions, we welcome them, because we want to put as much public comment into these PowerPoints and also ultimately the final report that we put out.
And you guys get the benefit, this is the second rendition of this, and there'll be a third that eventually goes out, and that will be with all the wisdom of all the comments we've gathered.
September, October.
Yeah, late October, but again, we'll be back down in these areas in about 2 weeks of Western.
I'd just like to take a step back and look at the big picture of your presentation. You know, you've really done a great job to present a lot of information. And the state obviously has extremely ambitious goals for increased production of renewable energy. And it seems to me that your presentation is dominated by two principles here. One is that solar energy is an extremely weak form of energy. There's very little energy density to solar energy, unlike nuclear and fossil fuel. So you need a huge gathering mechanism, right? And what that means is that you have a huge footprint. It's incredibly land intensive. I mean, whether you're using the roof of the YMCA or whether you're using a farm, you know, you're going to have to put in probably hundreds of square miles of solar panels to get to where you want to be by 2030 if you just add up the footage or the acreage or whatever. And then the other principle for this renewable energy is it's all based on the concept of moving from central, you said in your very first slide, I think, from centralized production to distributed production. So centralized generation and out through the spokes into this distributed mechanism. But I think that most people in this room, from what we've seen, and from, this is echoing a little bit of Sharon's comments, you know, what you're really proposing is distributed industrialization. And you need land to execute this program. And we have a lot of undeveloped land here in Hopkinton, right? I mean, no one in this room, I don't think, has any objection to your developing brownfields and rooftops and that kind of thing. But what's here is a lot of undeveloped land, whether it's farms or residences or so forth. So these residential areas like us and Coventry and stuff, they're all, you know, a big part of your plans in the future. The problem is that the land in Hopkinton that's undeveloped is either conservation, which has these easements that you're talking about, and there's a lot of that. And actually the Nature Conservancy and various foundations have worked really hard over the past several decades to acquire conservation land here because they're trying to establish wildlife corridors, right? They're trying to connect all these pieces, I'm sure you know that. Well, certainly this runs completely counter to that. You know, deer aren't going to go through chain link fences and you're basically erecting barriers. But one, you've promised not to touch conservation land. Second category is residential land, and the third one would be a lot of these farms. We have a lot of acreage here that's in farm, forest, and open use. So I see in your various slides, like, you know, you have principle number 6, you're going to honor the commitment to keep permanently protected land free from development. Well, in this town right now, except when the town council determines to do otherwise and override the planning board in the process, residential land is protected from commercial development, including solar, right? That's the barrier, residential and commercial. So we feel that we're temporarily protected, not permanently protected from this form of development, and we think that you are decentralizing your industrialization by putting it out here and attacking our plans. A lot of your prescriptions that are only proposed, but like the first one said, you know, one option would be don't permit solar in your town. And then every single bullet point after that, whether it was a special permit or major land development use or, you know, these various options, you prescribed a whole series of functions that, my understanding is, would erase this prohibition against solar development on residential, would allow it on residential property, it's only a recommendation, but then subject it to a set of criteria. So this zoning restriction would be replaced by, you know, special use permit criteria and that sort of thing. So, you know, I think that I see almost all of your recommendations as being extremely threatening to the character of this town. When you say decentralized distribution of electricity or production of electricity, I see that you are subjecting our town to, you know, this program, if it were enacted, and we want to talk about farms too, this program, if it were enacted, and it's what we're doing right now with these various spot zoning proposals that are reactive to developers that want to take a large residential parcel and industrialize it. These actions of our town, some of the actions of some members of our town council who voted for it, and a lot of these prescriptions are proposing to turn this town into a quilt instead of having residential and commercial separate.
The question. And you have obviously concerns.
Hey, Frank,
Hey, he's making a good point. Let's
No, he is.
Let him
He is.
speak.
He is.
Excuse me.
You don't have to make points.
All right, excuse me.
Go on and on.
I was here last Monday and you babbled me into silence, and this is a public meeting and
It is
I'm
a
going to
public meeting,
speak,
but ask
okay?
your questions so we can go.
Hey, we don't want to go.
I'm
We wanna
giving
hear
him my
this.
feedback.
You might want to go.
You want
Go.
to read the advertisement
Eric.
for the meeting? Frank,
Let him
excuse me,
get-
Frank, stop interrupting me, okay?
That's it.
I run the meeting, Eric, not you. Sit down. Sit down. Mr. Kearns, you want to answer his questions? That's
Why don't you get
fine.
security and have him move?
Just have a seat.
No, I'm not
All right, then
going
don't sit.
Frank, I'm sorry, what you
Should I finish my point about farms? Okay. So if you have restrictions on farms that say that you can't develop more than 20% of your farm or lose your farm forest and open use status, and I have property in farm forest and open use, or in this town it's a little more restrictive, it might be 5 or 10%. you know, one of my best friends in town is a hay farmer. He has 100 acres of land, and his various siblings each have 100 acres too. And I said, did you get any proposals from developers? And he said, yes. I said, more than one? He said, yes. I said, how many did you get? 15. Okay, now they consider converting a section of their farm into solar development subject to these restrictions, right? But it was tempting, right? And then they decided personally that they didn't want to drive past the solar panels to get onto their farm for the rest of their lives, which if it's 30 years, it's the rest of your life for a lot of us, okay? But if they personally decided to do that, and if 10 other farmers, 20 other farmers in this town decided to do that, they're allowed by right, essentially, to do that, right? So this community, which has worked hard to preserve its rural character, right, could be a patchwork of farms, each of which has 10 acres of solar panels that we're going to drive past on every road in town. So my point is that your scheme here is sacrificing the rural character of these towns. You're drawing a red line around the conservation areas. You're not really protecting these wildlife corridors, despite giving lip service to it. But there's a great risk here of really changing the overall character of the towns, because there are some very lucrative incentives for town councils to be responsive to in terms of the newly enacted energy taxes, right? So I think you've got to be really careful. You're going to need a giant footprint, and I really feel a lot of these presentations are trying to seduce these towns into watering down the protections for these large residential tracts. And I think that's a shame. So if you care to respond to that, that's what I would like to have your response to. Thanks, Frank. I want to see what you feel.
Again, I think in terms of the farmlands, that's going to be a dynamic in terms of if a farm is approaching a town, and again, so there was a dairy farm in South Kingstown. They were phasing out the dairy operations of the project. They wanted to do a ground mount solar project, I believe, similar to the Reynolds Farm size type property. They didn't want to do a solar system, but they were making economics. So that's, I know, the farmers that they grapple with in terms of, I've heard the personal stories in terms of, I've heard there's a cranberry marsh type farmer up in Coventry. You know, he's facing financial difficulties. So again, there's no easy answer. And particularly, I think there's the farm and there's the developed residential zone farm. The farmlands, again, are a dynamic in terms of it's either the farm is preserved through like an NGO, if that can happen, great, or it's economically viable to continue to feed farmland activities, maybe like that hay farmer. It sounds like he's been profitable, or it's potentially housing development or another form. That's what each respective town's going to have to grapple with in terms of what they want to happen on those properties. There's no easy answer. Again, the solar projects take up a large footprint. You know, wind could potentially be a viable solution in terms of some of these projects to be built and isolated, but a lot of towns just said outright, we don't even want to consider any applications.
Well, I do understand wind. You said that people don't want to look at the towers.
They don't want to look at the towers.
Okay, but that's not the issue. I know this issue.
It's a big issue with the
noise and flicker.
So they don't want to look at it, the flicker or the sound, depending on where they're situated. But again, a lot of towns have banned it outright. A wind turbine takes up a much smaller footprint than the equivalent size of a solar system.
Sure, but Cape Cod, for example, has a restriction. You can't have a residence within 10 times rotor diameter, which would be 3,250 feet. So that's about the noise. And maybe a tiny little footprint, but that noise that it broadcasts is a giant area. And that's why the towns aren't doing it.
Well, again, what towns have done is just ban it outright within all zones, including commercial industrial zones. So
but I don't talk about wind. I just think that,
and we have guidelines for towns if they choose to adopt wind turbines in their zoning ordinance.
When you take down the barrier,
same process for them.
So when you take down the barrier between residential and commercial, and the conversion of a residential property doesn't require a change to the comp plan and a change to the zoning for that parcel, you're making it a whole lot easier for developers to just meet a set of criteria.
We're not really going to get into what your town is doing. We're here to provide the information to enable both sides and all stakeholders to make rational decisions on whether or not this use is appropriate for their community. There's also another aspect of it that we didn't mention. There's an environmental justice issue here. Everybody in this room uses power. Most of our power is not produced in the communities we live in, and we are in the distributed network system. That's also a factor that has to be considered of environmental justice. Of not everything can be supported by the urban core communities and the power plants that are in Providence. So we're trying to not only make ourselves less dependent on fossil fuels that come from other places in the country, but also spread sort of the hurt around the state. Yeah, that's what's happening. Everyone has to share this environmental justice.
I wish I had a really.
So you're gonna cut down thousands of trees and displace millions of creatures.
That's not what we're saying. We're giving you the tools to decide how to do it and what's appropriate for your community.
President Nancy, I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
The state tells us that every community in the state has to have 10% minimum housing, and that's a new law. What do you think the potential is of someday the state coming down and saying, okay, Hopkinton, you got all this land, East Providence, you have game land, so too bad for you, and good for you, but Hopkinton, you got all this land, you have to have so many acres of solar panels. Do you think that's a possibility, that the state can tell us how much minimum housing we have to have? At what point do they come down and say, you've got to have so many acres of your property because the inner city can't produce the power, and so you have to, so is that a possibility?
Beautiful rooftops and trees.
I'm concerned about it. That's a serious concern.
Yeah, so I don't think that is anything that I've heard.
No, I know.
In terms of one of the things that we try doing is part of the dynamic is some towns have adopted ordinances where other towns haven't. So that's created a market where the solar markets are more active in certain towns versus others because there's no ordinances in place. So one of the things that we try to address this legislative session as part of this dynamic is a lot of these renewable programs have been in place since 2008, 2009. After 10 years, there really is no excuse for all 39 towns to have the rules in place for what can and can't be allowed within their respective jurisdictions. What you've had is, again, it's worked, it has its pluses and minuses. Some towns have adopted ordinances quicker than other towns that don't have anything. So East Providence, you mentioned, they don't have a solar ordinance. They just do everything through a special use permit process. And the challenge with a special use permit, or if it's a case-by-case basis, is there's no public engagement, there's no public awareness of what the process is. And then and then a project pops up, and then that creates that kind of backlash because people are like, we didn't know about this project popping up. Because again, there's no predictable, here's the zoning rules for solar. That's what we're trying to recommend instead of this kind of patchwork where a developer goes to a town council or planning board and gets that specific project approved without any fundamental criteria in place within the respective town.
The same is true if you define a butter as 200 feet. You get 5 people get letters and an entire neighborhood is in the dark. So, a lot of these provisions for notifying the butters are incredibly weak.
Well, that's a different issue in your ordinances, and you have the ability to set your notice radius based on your zoning districts. You can do that within your code, but you have to do that as a formal adopted process as you adopt the zoning ordinance. If you want a 200 foot, that works. Some communities, they only want 100 feet. Cranston doesn't want to notify everyone with 200 feet. Maybe you want a 500 foot, but again, it's your local determination through the zoning ordinance adoption process.
Yes. I have another question for you. With regards to your recommendations, typically you work front to back in terms of using lessons learned with historical projects and saying, this would be our recommended guidance because of this, and this that's happened in the past on these renewable energy projects. On your recommendations, can you estimate how many of those recommendations are based on historical evidence of this has worked, this hasn't, this has worked, this hasn't, on large industrial size projects? And can you specifically touch on, for example, firefighting, preventing regenerative growth? This young lady's question. When you work forwards, how many lessons learned or previous large-scale industrial renewable energy projects did you use to evaluate your recommendations or to develop your guidance? What was your basis?
So in terms of what we looked at, both residential and roof-mounted commercial projects, but also any of the large-scale projects that are operational now that we're aware of. So it ranges in terms of where they're happening.
And how about in terms of their time in use? I get the sense that these are the case studies that you presented are very relatively new.
So most
How
of
about ones that have gone from initial construction all the way through completion and decommissioning? How many, your
We haven't got to
recommendations?
that
I-
point
well, I
yet.
don't think it's-
Decommissioning is still years away.
Again, because-
So in all of these stakeholders, are there experts that have been involved in complete projects from start to finish?
keep in mind,
Or is this basis based on just snapshots in time for relatively new projects?
These are all, we looked at projects all operational within the last 5 to 7 years in time period.
In Rhode Island only?
We're focusing on Rhode Island. It's certainly a good question that we can take back to the advisory group to discuss. Most of the state's renewable policy laws haven't been in place for more than 10 to 15 years. So the reality is that we don't have a lot of case studies to reference to in terms of decommissioned solar systems in the New England region, because most of the solar systems that have been installed have been between, now dating back to the early to late 90s. So we haven't encountered a lot of large decommissioned projects that have entered their shelf life yet, because a lot of them are either at the beginning stage or maybe halfway through their life.
So your recommendations for that decommissioning bond, et cetera, that leaving it up to the municipalities to estimate that, let me move on. Firefighting in these areas. We operate on a volunteer fire system. We do not have a full-time fire department that is, has resources to deal with large-scale electrical fires, commercial-sized large-scale electrical fires. What basis did you use for developing your recommendation for working with the state on commercial electrical code? Did you have any examples of, for example, there's a large-scale utility in California that's affected by the wildfires there that's been virtually decimated. I just wonder, in your recommendations with regard to firefighting, for example, are there any large-scale lessons learned that you have that you based your recommendations on?
Again, in terms of the fire issue, we've had solar systems installed dating back to like the mid-1990s. I'm not aware of any reported fire incidents that have ever occurred on whether it's roof or ground-mounted projects.
Again, in Rhode Island?
In Rhode Island. And again, the wildlife issues in terms of what's happening in California, I'm not even aware of the extreme temperatures that they've experienced over the last 3 to 5 years with the random wildfires that have been encountering those temperatures ever even approaching in Rhode Island. So again, we're basing our data upon all the existing systems that we are aware of within Rhode Island. In terms of the fire issue, I've never seen or reported a case of a fire incident regarding a roof or a ground-mounted project, either with our State Building Commission office or our fire and electric code boards that are through the Department of Labor and Training.
Do you have a framework that would allow us to take your recommendations and work backward to find what the basis is that you use for developing that recommendation?
Well, that's going to be all of our working group meetings and the expertise of the people that were involved in the working group. We also had municipal planners involved, and the municipal planners talked to their fire departments, whether they be municipal or whether they be volunteer, and brought us the expertise from.
Do you guys have a local, do you have a fire marshal that's a volunteer, or is that somebody on the staff within the town?
No staff person.
Okay.
Well, you probably have multiple fire districts.
We have
We've
two.
worked, I'm a zoning official, I've worked with, we have 2 different fire districts within the town. And we decided upon certain things that we would accept based on the fire code as to the vegetation management plans, low growth, and those are the things that our distinctive fire marshals that they were comfortable with and what was incorporated into the fire code as far as recent adoptions regarding solar facilities.
Okay. So is there kind of in terms of if somebody wanted to do some type of wildlife seeding within the panels, is there the discretion by the local fire marshal to evaluate the merits of it on a case-by-case basis?
The way it stands right now, I don't think it would be permitted through the fire districts.
Yeah. So that's again one of the dynamics in terms of all these projects. The system sizes are generally similar, but the topography is different. So you may want to have, when you look at your ordinance, if you do look at your ordinance, you can possibly give some flexibility for that fire marshal to evaluate a project, because a vegetative management plan is probably going to be different on a landfill versus, again, like an undeveloped residential type.
Or have the fire official, whoever that may be, advise the planning board when they do their review. I know that's handled in some of the communities.
I just want to summarize, basically, your presentation is giving suggestions. It's not, and based on Hopkinton, how we zone our properties is still based on the comprehensive plan, our own comprehensive plan. You're not trying to change that.
We are not mandating
Right.
anything.
Okay.
And some of the suggestions may work, some of them may not work. Again, what we're doing is, a lot of the planning boards the planning board directors or staff that have participated had recommended that these projects should go through planning boards. That's why we recommended the development plan review, because it goes through the planning board and not the zoning board.
And it's also, I think, a lot of your suggestions we've already accomplished. We already do that, and we're taking a look at our solar ordinances, because this isn't our first rodeo. Unfortunately, we've had any number of pieces come before us. We've already had 15 projects approved, and we have another dozen in the works. So unlike Cranston or East Greenwich, where we don't have rooftops, we don't have parking areas, and we don't have parking lots, we've already had a lot of this. And so some of these things you've suggested, we've already taken into consideration. We've already raised our fences 6 inches. We've already done a lot of that, and the planning board's been working quite hard at it. So we will still take more of your suggestions, and I'm sure working with the planning board and zoning, and I do think it'd be very wise for the fire departments to have some flexibility, because if we're going to do them, I certainly want plants underneath. I want the cottontails, I want the marmots, I want the opossums, I want the animals to have a place to live. And I know CEM is addressing it too, to say these are things that will not grow too tall. So I think we've taken a lot of your suggestions already, because again, because we're Hopkinton, we've had solar come to us left, right, and center. And it's frustrating because we learn on the run too.
And the majority, okay, I'm actually a Bradford native, grew up in Bradford. Are the majority of the projects, I've heard about the residential projects over the last month or so, month and a half, but the projects from like 2015, 2016, were those in residential, commercial,
We had all,
farmland?
we had one farms, residential, commercial, 11 megawatts, 15 megawatts. No, we've already done some massive ones.
Well, we've approved 4 to date.
Yeah.
Two
Majority
outlets, 2 residential.
of those
Two of them are very large.
The rest were commercial and/or farm by the.
So we've actually done quite a bit already. And our
Council's
issue
only
is,
done 4.
the council's only done 4, but the planning board has done 15, so.
And we're in the process of amending our ordinance, because we realized once we put it forward that it needed to be tweaked in a bunch of areas.
But that is why you're allowed to amend things, because, you know, you try your best and you do your best effort to do something that works, and then you find out through practice that you need to tweak or change something.
And some of the suggestions are useful, that we haven't thought of, many of them we already did think of, but we appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you for
All
having
right,
us.
thanks.
Thank you.
Motion
guys.
adjourned.
Thank you.
All those in favor?
Aye.